Welcome to part 3 of rebuilding section 2 of my layout. Well, it is May 14th and it is 60 degrees outside right now at 4 a.m. That is cold. It's been between 95 and 104 degrees past week or so. So a 60-degree morning is pretty nice. I have 10 pieces of flex track, and this is Atlas Code 83. That's what I've used in the rest of the layout, so I'll continue using that. I figure I'm going to need about 12 pieces to get in and out of the Helix, plus track for completing the rest of section 2. I ordered 10 more pieces of Atlas Code 83. Hopefully that'll be enough to finish this project. But right now I have 10 pieces, so I'm going to use these 10 pieces and go as far as I can. Now I bought a spool of 20 gauge solid core wire that I'm going to use for my feeders. What I'm going to do is cut up 20 sets of 12-inch long feeder wires. And then I'll attach these to the pieces of flex track that I have. So I'll cut all these feeder wires. I'll strip one end and tin it. All right, got my assembly line here. Got my flux. So flux on these wires. Gonna hit it with the big heat. I use this soldering gun for just about everything. Get it hot, clean off the tip. Tin it. All right. Get her done. One thing I got to keep straight is the movable rail. So I'm always going to keep the movable rail to the inside. So now I'm going to go ahead and tin up the outside rail, and I have this set up where I'm going to put feeders here and here. I have the outside feeders soldered onto these sections of flex track. So now these are ready to install on the Helix. What I've come up with is I made 4 tools. Designed these in Blender, printed these on my 3D printer. Now I have a slot here for soldering. But these tools are for a 27-inch radius. Now you can see the track where I have the tool lines up with the mark on my Helix roadbed. With this fixture in place, and what I could do is trim the rails so they butt together, apply a joiner in here, and with this opening I can get in there with a soldering iron and solder the rails. But even so, without rail joiners, you can see there's a kink here. It kinks. So that's my dilemma I have to figure out. How am I going to solder together all this track and avoid having kinks in the track? I've installed 2 6-foot sections of flex track on the Helix Now I did have to make a solder connection on the Helix to connect the two 6-foot sections. So far things are looking pretty good. So the care I took in trying to get the roadbed flat is paying off with my track. And you can see the track here is perfectly flat this way. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to glue the splice plate in place. I'm going to go ahead and start gluing in these spacers for the second tier. And you can see I have my 3D printed parts in here for spacing the second tier. So I'm going to go ahead and start gluing these in place, and hopefully these will be dry about the same time that splice plate dries. I have these wooden spacers glued in place. I've been soldering up 2 sections of flex track to install on the Helix. That's one less solder joint that I have to make on the Helix. I have the flex track pinned up against my yardstick to keep it straight, so I get a nice straight solder joint right here. I made 4 of these fixtures. I designed these in Blender, printed them out on my 3D printer. They fit down in between the rails of the flex track, and I have this gap in here where I can solder the rail joiners. Now I thought this would help me with this specific job, soldering up these rail joiners on a curve. But even so, there's a kink in the track here. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to solder this joint, and when the solder is still hot, I'm going to take this stick and I'm going to push the track out. And then hopefully once the solder sets up, I can let the pressure off this stick and it will be more round. But you can see as it is now, it's kinked. There's just nothing you can do about it. It just kinks. Give that solder enough time to cool. Kind of melted my ties there a little bit. Look down on top and align it with the fixture. You can see I have that curve set pretty close. So hopefully that's going to work out. I'm going to do the same thing with the outside rail. With this joint soldered, I can now go ahead and glue down the track. This was the solder joint I was working on, where I had it bridged with my 3D printed fixture. And then while the solder was still wet, I pressed on the joint with the stick. And you can see the joint is pretty much kink free. So I'm satisfied with how that turned out. I'll let the track adhesive set up for a few hours, and then I will solder in the red inner feeder wires. At the end of this section of track, I have my track fixture in place to maintain the radius through the curve while the glue sets up. Now I ended the glue probably about 6 inches from the end of the track. But I want to maintain that radius just to make sure everything's in alignment. From this point onwards, I'm going to be pushing the radius of the track out. Now this bottom tier, the radius of the track is 27¼ inches. I'm going to push the radius of the track out to 28 inches on the top turn of the Helix. Now there's some imperfections in the plywood, so as the Helix is built up, there may be some inaccuracy that's brought into the Helix but it should be minor. All right, it is 3:45 in the morning. It's nice and cool out. I'm going to take the red feeder wires, solder those into this latest section of track. Once that's done, I can remove all my 3D printed tools for spacing the tier. All the wood spacers should be dry. And then I can start adding this last piece of the helix. I have the last piece of the helix in place. Now I'll cut it off over here at the high point, the entrance exit. And from there it'll go straight out along the backdrop. I have all my 3D printed spacers in place. Now what I'm going to do is I have this 3/16 ply splice plate that goes in right here. I can't use a 1/2-inch piece because it takes up too much vertical height. I think it'll be strong enough, especially once I get all these spacers in place all along here. Now I have 21 of them here, and I'm going to apply those every 12 inches on the inside, every 12 inches on the outside. And I ended up cutting an additional 10. I had 32. I ended up with 42. So I'm going to glue those in place. I'm going to glue the splice plate in place. And then I'm going to prep my last two pieces of flex track. Well, I have the last piece of the helix glued into place. You can see I have the ply spacers all glued in. I'll probably leave those 3D printed parts in place until tomorrow, just to make sure these get plenty of time to cure. I have the splice plate glued in place right here. Got the 4 clamps. Something I can do while this glue is setting up is I can start making a template and cutting pieces for coming out of the helix. Now I'm going to want to run this template up along the backdrop. And I'm going to want to put a piece in place up about even with the helix at this point. I'm using these folders to create a template. And you can see here I'm cutting this template to fit this area where I'm exiting out from the helix. My template fits on my largest piece of plywood. So I'm going to go ahead and trace this out, and then I will cut it out with my jigsaw. Well, I got my road bed cut. Before I can do anything with it, I'm going to have to cut some risers to set it on. I'm going to be using 2-inch foam for my risers, so I'm going to be cutting strips 3 inches wide, and then I'll cut them to various lengths. Alright, I got the foam blocks cut for that piece of road bed, and what a mess, my God. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to do this a couple more times. I have the foam blocks glued together. And I have the one piece of roadbed there. So I'm going to set that up in place and just see what I have. All right, got that piece of plywood set in place. Now, that is not where it's going to be permanently mounted. It's just a preliminary fit. The foam is going to have to be trimmed. Now, this needs to come down almost 2 inches between this point here and this point right here. So what I want to do first, before I even get into this, is I want to take care of getting the rest of the track on the Helix, at least up to this point right here. The Helix is built. I have all the feeders in place. Track is laid to right here, and that's as far as I can take it for now. The track has to be cleaned before you can even consider putting a locomotive on there. I have adhesive and flux and whatever all over the track. But I don't think I'm going to wire up the bus to the feeders until I get some work done over here. So with the Helix construction finished, I think I'm going to end this video here. I want to thank you for watching, and I hope you come back and join me again.